Welcome to Lesson 4, the election processes. The first thing we're going to explore over the next 2 weeks is political participation. Now, what is political participation? Well, the textbook gives the definition that it's actions of private citizens to influence or support government and politics. Now, what does that mean? That's, you know, actions of a private citizen, but there's two different types of participation. The first is conventional participation. This is using institutional channels to make political gains in the way that is acceptable to society. So these are things like campaigning, voting, running for public office. These are all things that are considered conventional within the norm of society. Now, unconventional participation, these are the use of tactics to gain political gains that defies the established norms or institutions. These are things like marches, strikes, and sit-ins. And these are something that's designed to make society uncomfortable, to force change. A good example of this were the works of the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., doing sit-ins and strikes and marches during the civil rights era of the 1960s and 1970s. So there's two types, and neither one's wrong. Conventional is just within what most people consider to be acceptable within the rules of society, and unconventional are ones that defy the established norms but are not necessarily illegal. Something like marching or striking or sitting in, these are not illegal acts. They are basically things to make the government and the people uncomfortable enough to create some kind of change. Now, when we look at voting, and that's kind of the basic one that we're going to discuss this week in the first half of this 2-week lesson, we have to look at the evolution of voting in America. Now, first, under the United States Constitution, the way it was essentially left is that white men with property were allowed to vote. So in 1789, 1790 time period, if you were a white male that owned a certain amount of property, you were allowed to vote. Now, what is the reasoning behind this? Well, the reasoning behind it is that people with property have a stake in the game, that they own something that's important, and therefore they should have a little more say than, say, someone who just happens to rent and not have any actual real property. But by 1800, the society has changed within 10, 12 years, and we have what's called Jeffersonian democracy, where Thomas Jefferson says, no, yeah, you should have some skin in the game, and maybe you should have some kind of property to show for it, but you should also be educated. And so what Jefferson decides to begin to do through a series of laws is to allow for people with some kind of education to also be able to vote and hold public office. And his reasoning was maybe you should have a stake in the game, but you should also understand how these things work. You shouldn't just go out and vote simply because you have the right to do it. Well, this changes again in the 1820s and the 1830s. And this is what we call Jacksonian democracy. And this was spearheaded mainly by President Andrew Jackson. Now, Jackson realized something very important, that yes, people with property should be able to vote, and people with money should be able to vote, and people with education should be able to vote. But the best voters are those who don't have an education and they don't have money. Because Jackson figured out that these were the people that you could get on your side very easily without any real knowledge of what's going on, and you could basically convince them whatever you needed to get their vote. So within the 1820s and 1830s, you do begin to see this change where by 1850, you essentially have all white males having the right to vote. So from 1789 to 1850, you go from only having white males with property to having all white males being able to vote. This was a major change. And this does liberalize democracy quite a bit. I mean, you do see a large percentage from 1789 to 1850. So when we talk about all the minority groups that are not going to be able to vote at this time, that's absolutely right. But just remember, being a white man in 1789 did not guarantee you the right to vote. It was fluid. It did change over a period of time. Now let's look at how some of these things worked, how they evolved. First, African Americans. Now, African Americans were essentially property prior to 1860 or 1865 in almost all of the states in the South. In the North, they were what we call freed men, but their political power was dependent on the state. And most of the time, they did not actually have any real political power. Okay, they were simply simply there. But in 1870, the 15th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution guaranteed that the government could not take away people's rights based solely on their skin color. Now, this did not mean that African Americans were now guaranteed to have the right to vote, because the South was able to put in other checks like grandfather clauses or literacy tests or poll taxes in order to make sure that African Americans could not vote in the South. Another thing that happened was in 1944. We have a Supreme Court case called Smith v. Allwright. The textbook discusses this. And prior to 1944, states would not allow, especially in the South, would not allow African Americans in states that allowed African Americans to vote, would not allow them to vote in party primaries. And the reason why is they considered party primaries to be, and political parties themselves, to be private organizations that you had to be a member of, and they did not allow African Americans to be members of that club. Well, this was argued in January of 1944 and was decided in April that states could not permit or conduct race-based primaries, meaning you could not have a primary election where African Americans were not allowed to vote. Primary and general elections had to be open to all groups. And by the way, this was I think it was a 6-3 or a 7-2 decision. I can't remember off the top of my head, but it was not even a close decision on this. It was very, very strong in that. But still, African Americans did not have the right to vote. That is until 1965, when it made it a federal crime to pass laws preventing African Americans from voting. The Civil Rights and the Voting Rights Act of 64 and 65 guaranteed African Americans the right to vote. And this is really the beginning of that. This is the beginning of forcing states to comply with the 15th Amendment, the spirit of the 15th Amendment, maybe not the actual meaning of it. In 1966, Harper v. Virginia State Board of Education was another Supreme Court case. This will finally strike down the usage of poll taxes. What was happening with a lot of these lower level elections was that they were still putting on poll taxes. You had to pay a tax or a fee in order to vote. And what the Supreme Court says is that no, you cannot make a condition of having the right to vote being able to pay a fee or a tax, because that violates the Equal Protection Clause. Everyone should have the right to vote, regardless of whether they have the money to do it or not. I think, and this was not a close one either. It was like 6-3 or 6-3 or 7-2. It was not close in that as well. Now, sadly, things have kind of gone a little bit back. In 2013, the Supreme Court reviewed the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and they declared that segregation and discrimination of African American voting was now done, that the South was completely reconstructed, and so they struck down major provisions of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. What we saw from this, though, unfortunately, was many states begin to try to add things back in that made it harder for African Americans to vote. One thing is, we all think about this idea of everyone having an ID as being able to vote, and that just seems common sense. And I mean, we can make that argument that it does, but let's be clear that in order to have an ID, you have to be able to pay for it. Now, some states, it's very cheap. I know my home state of Delaware, you can get a voting ID for $10. But some states, your driver's license being renewed is very expensive, and they make it very expensive on purpose. And that's so that people without, money don't necessarily get it done. So, there are some extreme examples, but not many, but extreme examples where some states are beginning to pull back legalizing, minority voting. So we have to keep an eye on that as people who study political science. Now, how about women? Well, before 1869, women did not have the right to vote. They were considered an extension or property of their husband, and therefore their husband voted on their behalf. They voted and the women did not. Now, in 1869, when Wyoming Territory was founded, they did allow women the right to vote. And this was really where this is gonna happen. In the West, where things are much more democratic, things are a lot tougher, and women are working really hard alongside the men. The men are going to allow women the right to vote in 1869, and it's followed in 1893 by Colorado. So 2 states by basically the turn of the century have given women the right to vote, and then by 1896 to 1918, so within a 20-year period, you begin to see states really beginning, and again, these are Western states mainly, begin to give women the right to vote. 1 year you'll have a couple, then you'll have a couple more, then you'll have a couple more. So finally, in the later part of the 19-teens, Congress will approve a constitutional amendment. This will be the 19th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. So it's approved in 1919, and by the summer of 1920, the 19th Amendment is ratified. So women will now be guaranteed the right to vote. So now, white men, African American men, by this point, we're considering I've gone all the way through the evolution. And now white women have the right to vote. Black women, of course, are also given that right to vote in the 1965 Voting Rights Act, but all women were given the right to vote theoretically in 1920. Just black women's right to vote was not upheld until 1965. Now, 1920 is, by the way, the first election where women were guaranteed the right to vote. And so 1920 will be a watershed year, and we're coming up on the 100th anniversary of women being able to have the right to vote. Just to tell you one thing about the right to vote, my father's mother was born in 1917, and my grandmother was born in 1919. So when we think about this and you say, oh God, women have had the right to vote for a long time, that was my grandmother's. My grandmothers did not have the right to vote the moment they were born. My great-grandmother was born in 1891, who I knew growing up, and until she was an adult, she did not have, and well into her adult life, she did not have the right to vote. Now, one other evolution of voting is in I can't remember the exact date, but the 26th Amendment, and it'll come to me in a minute. 1971, that's the date. In 1971, Congress will approve and the states will ratify the 26th Amendment. And this came around because of Vietnam, the Vietnam War. 18-year-olds were being drafted. They were considered adults for military service, but you could not vote until you were 21 years old. Well, in 1971, this is brought down to 18. So it goes from being 21 to 18. So this is how voting had liberalized from 1789 all the way through current day. Now let's look at the policy of voting. And this is basically how voting has evolved and what kind of voting you can do after each different era. And the first we're going to look at is the Progressive Era. And for this purpose, the Progressive Era basically is from 1900 to 1925. One of the first things that we decided to do during the Progressive Era was the beginning of direct primaries, where voters chose the party nominees by direct election. Now, this had not always been the case. Some nominees were chosen by a caucus, party members who got together in smoky rooms and decided things behind closed doors. Others were done by congressional delegation. Some were done by state legislature. So beginning here in 1900, you begin to see the call for direct primaries. You also see the call for recalls. And what a recall is essentially an electoral process to remove a candidate or a government official. The most recent example of this was in 2003 or 2004 when the California governor Gray Davis was recalled by the voters and was replaced in office by Arnold Schwarzenegger. And essentially this allows for someone to remove a government official if they don't believe they're doing a good job. Another thing that was called for during the Progressive Era were referendums. And this is essentially an election on policy and legislation. Do you think that we should make this law? An example of a popular currently referendum around the United States has been the legalization of marijuana. States have had referendums and they have decided on the state policy towards legalization or abolition of marijuana. And this is essentially legislation by the voter. This is as close to direct democracy as the United States has. Another thing is initiatives. Now, this is sort of hand in hand with a referendum. This is where voters propose legislation or some kind of government reform that will then be brought either to the legislature or bring up in a referendum. So, for example, you want to pass a law making it, I'm going to just use marijuana again since I used it before, making marijuana legal. So you would put on the ballot an initiative asking whether or not the voters think that there should be some kind of legislation dealing with the legalization of marijuana. And then if it passes, it should either go to the legislature for them to deal with, or it would then go to a referendum, and the wording of the referendum would be, should marijuana be legal, yes or no? And then the referendum would be the actual election on the policy. The initiative would be proposing that policy or legislation. So these are things that were changed in the early part of the 1900s that have made a lot of good changes. Some are not. I would argue that sometimes recalls are narrow-minded. Government officials are given a term within a certain amount of years. They should be able to work their policies. Recall probably should only be used for certain things like criminal behavior and things of that matter. But again, that's up for debate. Another thing we're going to explore over the next 2 weeks are political parties. Now, what is a political party? Well, political parties are organizations that sponsor candidates for a political office, and they do so under their organization's name. So the Democratic Party is an organization, the Republican Party is an organization, and there are members of those parties that then are sponsored as candidates for political offices. So, for example, the incumbent president, Donald J. Trump, he is a Republican, and he is a member of the Republican Party, and the Republican Party is sponsoring him as their nominee for President of the United States in 2020. The same thing about former Vice President Joseph Biden. Biden is a member of the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party is sponsoring his candidacy as the nominee of their party, and they both are doing so under those organizations' names. Now, how does a person become the nominee of their party? Well, first of all, the nominee is essentially the official candidate. There was a lot of talk prior to the conventions for presidential candidates about the presumptive nominee. Well, the person does not become the actual nominee until the convention when they vote for them to be the nominee. So when Joe Biden, for example, since he was running in a primary, a contested primary, when he was running and he got enough delegates to be the nominee, even though he had earned those delegates and he was the nominee, he still had to theoretically wait until the Democratic National Convention, until the vote, for him to become the actual nominee, the official nominee. Prior to that, they would be the presumptive nominee. So the nominee, or the person that gets the nomination, they are the official candidate of the political party. Donald J. Trump is the official candidate of the Republican Party here in 2020, and Joe Biden is the official candidate of the Democratic Party here in 2020. Now, how does it happen? Well, first of all, you have to nominate candidates for office. That is the one function of a political party. They nominate candidates for public office. They also structure voter choices. They come up with policies and procedures that maybe the government is not doing at the time to convince voters maybe you should vote for us. And then they also, once people are elected, they coordinate the actions of all the elected government officials to make sure that things are working well for their particular platform. All parties have a platform. All parties try to give their voters choices in order to get as many votes as possible. All parties propose alternative government programs and policies. When Barack Obama was president of the United States, the Republicans were always proposing alternative government policies and programs. And since Donald Trump has been president in 2016, 2017, the Democratic Party has done the same thing. So this is not something new. This is something that all political parties have done basically since the rise of the party system here in the late 1790s. Now let's look at the political parties here in the United States, and we're going to explore these more during week 2 of lesson 4, but I just want to introduce them right now. First of all, the Democratic Party is the oldest political party in the United States. It was founded theoretically in 1792, but it's had its present name since 1828. Now, how did the political parties evolve? Well, we have what's called a two-party system, and we are technically right now in the third party system, meaning we're in the third two-party system. Now, prior to 1796, we had what was called the pre-party period. From 1789 to 1797, George Washington served as president of the United States, and he claimed to be from no political party. The Federalists do claim him, and he is obviously more of a Federalist than an anti-Federalist or an anti-administration, but Washington always considered himself to be non-party. Now, the first political party, the first party system, I should say, was from 1796 to 1816, and this will involve the Federalist versus the Democratic Republicans. Now, the Federalists were those that supported George Washington and Federalist policies, a federal government with a strong national government, and states that were subservient to the federal government. And John Adams will be the Federalist president from 1797 to 1801. The Democratic Republican Party, they started out as the anti-administration or the anti-federalist party. Sometimes they're referred to as either Jefferson's Democrats or Jefferson's Republicans, or sometimes as Jeffersonian Democrats, just Jeffersonians. Jefferson will be president from 1801 to 1809, followed by Madison from 1809 to 1817, and then finally James Monroe from 1817 to 1825. Now, the Democratic Republicans will end up clearing the field. The Federalists will just die out after the War of 1812. And so from 1820 to 1824, we have another one-party system again. There's only one party here, and that's the Democratic Republican Party. And so for the second half of the Monroe administration, and for the 4 years of the second Adams administration, the administration of John Quincy Adams, there is only one party. Problem is, in 1824, the presidential election that brings John Quincy Adams to the White House sees a split amongst the Democratic Republican Party. Those people who supported Andrew Jackson in 1824, they will become the modern Democratic Party. Those who supported John Quincy Adams will refer to themselves as the National Republicans. And the National Republicans will eventually become, here in the second party system, the Whigs. And the second party system goes from 1828 to 1852. Andrew Jackson and Martin Van Buren will serve 12 years, 8 years for Jackson, 4 years for Van Buren. By the way, just a piece of historical interest, Martin Van Buren is elected in 1836 to succeed Andrew Jackson. He is Jackson's vice president. He is the last vice president to succeed his president by election until 1988, when George H.W. Bush succeeds Ronald Reagan. Now, you might say, well, wait a minute. I know there's other vice presidents who became president. Yes, there are. All but one of them did so by death or resignation, and the one that maybe you're going to say still did it by election is Richard Nixon. But remember, Nixon left office as vice president in 1861. He did not become president until 1869. By the way, if Joe Biden wins, he'll be in the same situation as Nixon. He did not succeed his 8-year president, two-term president, Barack Obama. He had to sit out 4 years, and then he was able to run on his own and win. It's very rare. Van Buren and George H.W. Bush are the only two in the modern era when we have actual political parties that actually do it, that are actually able to do it. Now, John Adams and Thomas Jefferson did it. Jefferson was John Adams' vice president, but I'll explain that when we get there. It's a little bit more complicated than that. The Whigs are president for 4 years. William Henry Harrison defeats Van Buren in the election of 1840. He serves for about a month. Then he's followed by his vice president, John Tyler. James K. Polk will serve 4 years from 1845 to 1849. He's a Democrat, a Jacksonian. He will then be followed for another 4 years by Zachary Taylor and Millard Fillmore. Taylor serves for about a year and a half. He dies in office. Fillmore fills out the rest of his term. So Fillmore, by the way, he is the last Whig president. He is also the last person to not be a Republican or Democrat to serve as president of the United States. So 1853, that is the last time we had anyone who was not a Republican or Democrat in the White House. Now, this brings us to the third party system. The third party system is from 1854 to present, and this is the Democratic Party versus the Republicans. In the early years of this, the Democratic Party was the party that had been around forever, so they are going to have a edge in this. But the first Republican to win election is Abraham Lincoln in 1860. Takes office in 1861. Obviously, we know why Lincoln is important. His election is important. It leads to secession and the Civil War. Now, in 1864, Lincoln is running for re-election. He is not given the Republican nomination, and so he will found his own political party called the National Union Party. That's why you see NU behind him. This is essentially the Lincoln Republican Party. He chooses as his vice president Andrew Johnson, a Democrat. This is a National Union Republican and Democratic ticket, and they win in 1864. Lincoln is re-inaugurated in 1865, and obviously he dies. Johnson will serve out the majority of Lincoln's term, and then the White House will turn over to a series of Republican presidents. Ulysses S. Grant will be president for 8 years, followed by Rutherford B. Hayes for 4 years. James A. Garfield will serve for about 5 or 6 months, followed by Chester A. Arthur, who will complete his term. Now, the Democrats do win 2 4-year terms, and that is under the one person, Grover Cleveland. Cleveland wins in 1884. He's president from 1885 to 1889. Benjamin Harris wins the Electoral College, but not the popular vote, so Cleveland leaves office. And then after one term, Cleveland is reelected to be president from 1893 to 1897. Then again, you have a series of Republican presidents. William McKinley will win. He'll be president from 1897 to 1901 when he is shot and killed, followed by a 2-term Theodore Roosevelt. Roosevelt will serve the majority of McKinley's first term and then a term of his own, followed by a 4-year term for William Howard Taft. The Democrats do finally come back here and win a 2-term White House under Woodrow Wilson. He's president from 1913 to 1921. Harding, Coolidge, and Hoover round out what we call the era of Republican prosperity of the 1920s. They are followed by about 25 years of Democratic rule. You have a 4-term incumbent, Franklin D. Roosevelt. He wins the elections of 32, 36, 40, and 44. He dies shortly into his 4th term and is replaced by Harry S. Truman. Then we get to a situation where we essentially flip-flop for years. We have an 8-year term for Eisenhower, followed by essentially an 8-year term for John F. Kennedy and Lyndon B. Johnson. Then we have a 8-year term for Richard Nixon and Gerald R. Ford. Then we have an anomaly. We have a 4-year term for the Democratic Jimmy Carter, 8 years for the Republican Ronald Reagan, 4 years for the Republican George H.W. Bush, and then we go to 3 8-year presidents, a Democrat, William Jefferson Clinton, or Bill Clinton, and then 8 years of George W. Bush of Texas, and then followed by 8 years of Barack Obama, a Democrat. Now, currently, we have a 4-year presidency of Donald J. Trump. In about 48 days, 46 days, we will determine whether or not he will be an anomaly like George H.W. Bush and Jimmy Carter, or he'll get his own term. He'll get a 2nd term in office and be an 8-year president. So this is the 3rd-party system in American politics. Now, here is basically a chart talking about everything I just went over, but this is just the picture format. You can see in 1789, George Washington, they call him a Federalist, but he really wasn't a member of the Federalist Party as much as he was just the rallying cry of the Federalist. He will be the first president under the Constitution, but the first party system, you see yellow and blue, you see the Federalist under John Adams versus the anti-Federalist Democratic Republican, Jefferson's Republicans, whatever you want to call them, Thomas Jefferson. Then, of course, Jefferson's party evolves into the Andrew Jackson Democratic Party, and then finally today's Democratic Party. The Federalist Party, not necessarily succeeded by, but A offshoot of the Jefferson Republican Party is the National Republicans, the John Quincy Adams Republicans. As I said, they became the Whig Party, and then the Whig Party and others join up to create the Republican Party, and that creates today's modern Republican Party. Now, I'm going to explain this more in a lecture, and you're going to have a series of lectures over the next 2 weeks. This is just the introductory lecture, but when you look at this, this is our introduction to the Electoral College. Now, what is the Electoral College? We hear it talked about all the time, but what is it? Well, prior to Election Day, every state allows all the parties to choose presidential electors. So the Democratic Party chooses electors, the Republican Party chooses electors, the Green Party, the Libertarian Party, they all choose electors. And in the case of Texas, they choose 38 electors. In the case of Delaware, they choose 3. Now, then we have Election Day, when we, the people, go out in each state and vote. There are 51 different votes. There's 51 different elections. Texas has their presidential election. Delaware has theirs. Florida has theirs. And so what happens is, what you're voting for is not necessarily for president. When you go in and vote for Donald J. Trump in November, or you vote for Joseph R. Biden, you're not voting for them. You are voting for a slate of electors to then go to Washington, D.C. on your behalf. So after the election's over, and I'm going to give you these examples, Delaware and Texas. I used to live in Delaware. Of course, we all live in Texas. After the election, what happens is, it's pretty safe to say that those 3 electoral votes for Delaware will be going to Joseph R. Biden. So Delaware will send 3 electors to the Electoral College to vote for Joe Biden. It's probably safe to say, although it's closer than it's been in years, that those 38 electoral votes from Texas will go to Donald J. Trump. So Texas will send 38 electors to vote for Donald J. Trump. There are 538 electors in all. And in order to win, you must have 270 votes. And why is it 270 votes? Well, that's actually kind of an easy thing. It's because all the votes added up after 270 cannot equal more or equal to 270. In fact, a tie in the Electoral College is 269-269. So you have to win. That is the magic number. And that's why when you hear on the news them talking about the race to 270, that is the number that counts. The popular vote does not count. It is how many electors are sent to the Electoral College to vote on your behalf for President of the United States. And so when we talk about the Electoral College next week, I think this is in the second half of the week, I'm going to put some stuff up about how campaigns figure out where to go campaign versus where to leave alone, how that sometimes works, how it sometimes backfires. So we will do a lot of looking at the Electoral College this week, or next week. I'm sorry, this is a 2-week class.